Hello, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Northwest Newsweek. I'm Mitchell Ringos. Northwestern Ontario First Nation is taking control of its child and family services. KI First Nation has signed a trilateral agreement with Canada and Ontario, recognizing the community's own family law. It's just the 7th agreement of its kind in the country. Lee Noonan was in KI for the signing ceremony.
Kitchinimekusipininewuk, Canada and Ontario have signed an important agreement supporting KI's jurisdiction over child welfare for their people and recognizing Kitchinimekusipininewuk Debenjikewin Onakunakewin, the First Nation's own family law, also called Keto.
We're taking back how we used to raise our kids.
Chief Morris says the biggest difference under Keto is that provincial and federal governments will have no say in what happens to their kids, who will no longer be sent away from the community. Canada and Ontario are committing not only equitable funding for child and family services, but also to facilitating coordination with other child welfare organizations in the province and across the country, and supporting family reunification.
Kids get to stay in their communities, raised, surrounded by aunties and uncles and grandparents, traditional ways, proud of who they are and connected to family. Isn't that what we all want?
It's about making sure that you're there to listen and you do your part, making sure that not a single child, not a youth, not a single family is forgotten in the entire province.
Work began on Keto back in 2007, and it was ratified by the First Nation in 2019 with an overwhelming 97% support in a community referendum. It's based on the community's traditional child-rearing practices.
We looked after our kids a long time ago. We have those skills. Let's just go back to them. Let's raise them the way, even with our language, our culture, put those things back in.
The agreement is the 7th of its kind in the country and the 2nd in the province to be signed since Canada passed Bill C-92.
Kitchinimekusipininewuk as a community defines leadership. Over the course of time, whether it's stewardship of the land, the environment, health care, especially care of their children, they've stepped forward and stepped up.
What KIA is doing is stepping away from colonial policies of the federal government, colonial policies from the provincial government, and making their own family law.
This process has opened the door where, we can do other laws, take other things on, and it's going to take time, but we'll get where we want to be in the future.
Morris says Keto will be only the first initiative of its kind. Next, he's setting his sights on lands and resources, healthcare, and education. Lee Noonan, TBT News.
Meanwhile, the Ontario Ombudsman is criticizing Anishinaabe Abenogi Family Services and 2 Southern Ontario child welfare organizations for failing to ensure the safety of a vulnerable Indigenous girl who went missing in 2020. The investigation found that 13-year-old girl from a Kenora area First Nation went missing 7 times while she was supposed to be under the supervision of a Southern Ontario foster care agency. A search party from her home community was unsuccessful, but she eventually returned to the foster home herself after suffering a number of serious harms. The Ombudsman has set out 23 recommendations for AAFS. The Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario have filed a human rights complaint against Public Safety Canada. The president of the group, who also heads up the Treaty 3 Police Service, says Ottawa's chronic underfunding of policing in their community amounts to discrimination. Jessica Clement has the details.
The complaint, which was filed on March 29th for the 9 First Nations police services in Ontario, is seeking $40,000 in damages per person for those living in communities served by First Nations police. It takes issue with the 1991 First Nations and Inuit policing program the federal government uses to fund its services, with many First Nations leaders saying it's suffering from a lack of resources. Kai Liu is the chief of Treaty 3 Police and also the president of the Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario. He says the finite amount of money in its budget has led to an underfunding of police, which has created ongoing challenges for First Nations policing services, including leaving various communities unpoliced.
When someone calls the Treaty 3 Police, it could take anywhere from 1 hour to 3 hours for our officers to respond. We simply do not have enough officers to have officers in every one of our 23 communities 24/7.
The program is governed by an underlying First Nations policing policy, which requires at minimum that First Nations benefit from the same standard of policing available to non-Indigenous communities. The complaint, which has been backed by the First Nations Police Service, states that the country has failed to deliver on those standards. The federal government previously said they would enact changes and declare First Nations policing an essential service. However, last week, the federal government has backed away from setting any timeline. Liu says he's not surprised that the timeline has been pushed back. He also says he doesn't see how the essential services legislation will automatically fix the chronic underfunding.
If Canada is not willing to come to the negotiation table and adequately fund our current police services, I don't know how, if tomorrow there was an essential service legislation, how that would change the chronic underfunding.
Liu is hoping they'll be able to sit down and negotiate with Public Safety Canada so that the First Nation communities can receive the same level of policing that non-Indigenous communities receive.
The ability to call the police and have the police respond in a reasonable timeline, I don't think it's too much to ask. And our hope is that by working together with our federal government, that we could come to we can find solutions that will provide the safety within our First Nation communities.
The Chiefs of Ontario and the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association have added their support and plan to seek intervener status. Jessica Clement, TBT News.
It's the end of an era for policing in KI, and there is one less Indigenous police service in the region. For decades, the First Nation on Big Trout Lake was served by their own law enforcement agency, the KI Police. The KI Police are no more. It has now been absorbed into the OPP. Lee Noonan has more.
After 21 years on the job, KI Police Sergeant Barry McKay is trading in his badge for one that reads OPP.
Saturday, Tulima 701. This is Sergeant McKay going 10-7 for KI Police. Thank you.
He and Constable Ava McKay are the last officers to wear the KI Police uniform. They were sworn into the OPP this week. The few other members of the First Nations small police force had already signed up with the OPP over the course of the transition. For Barry McKay, the end of the KI Police Service is sad, but he feels good about what's next.
To become an OPP officer, it's very exciting. It's still surreal to be I still can't believe it's actually happening.
The police station became an official OPP detachment on April 1st, but the provincial police already had a strong presence in the community, and KI Police had been under OPP administration for years. The transition shouldn't make much difference to the general population, according to Kitchener-Mekuse Beniniwak Chief Donnie Morris. For him, making the switch is all about getting equal treatment for the local officers.
So that's one of the things we figured. We might as well go OPP so they can automatically get the benefits, the help, the training in other areas of not just being an officer.
They have the opportunity to now become detectives if they wish to in a major crime unit. They could go into drug enforcement. There's our tactical response units. There's many different things within the OPP, and essentially now as constables, they could do anything that we offer. And they also have the opportunity, we don't want them to, but there's also the opportunity to now explore different areas of the province.
The change also means local officers will be eligible for the same bonuses other OPP officers receive for staying in the remote community. Despite being a veteran with decades of experience, McKay is still excited about the training opportunities.
Right now, there's this called a crisis negotiators course, and that's something I'm interested in doing, and also something like one of the specialty teams.
McKay says he's looking forward to starting a new chapter in his career here with the OPP. Lee Noonan, TBT News.
OPP and Anishinaabe police have charged a 22-year-old Slate Falls First Nation woman with second-degree murder after the body of a 32-year-old man was found in that community on Sunday. Police have identified the victim as David Brown of Wapakika First Nation. Amber Carpenter has been arrested and charged with the crime. She's been remanded into custody pending a court appearance in Kenora on Thursday. Slate Falls First Nation is located about 175 kilometers northeast of Sioux Lookout. The expert panel reviewing policing in Thunder Bay released its final report on Thursday, with 10 action proposals relating to issues of systematic racism, inclusion, officer mental health, and the need for future engagement with the Indigenous community. Vasilios Bellos attended the meeting and spoke to some of the board members about their thoughts on the recommendations and the benefits that could come through implementing them.
The findings and recommendations of the expert panel tasked with reviewing policing in Thunder Bay were presented Thursday night to the police board. Panel Chair Alok Mukherjee provided the presentation on the report, which calls for transformational change in areas of racism, labor relations, and workplace mental health. Police board member Shelby Chung recognizes this isn't the first time recommendations like this have been provided. Despite this, Chung's confident the adoption of a board governance committee and labor relations committee will be a crucial factor in implementing the recommendations.
I think that's where the real work is going to get done, and that's something that I don't think has really been explored in any kind of depth before with the board, but now we're going to set up those structures to make sure that we have a lot more community input, a lot more hands on deck to help us actually push forward and create these policies to make change.
High-ranking officials of the Thunder Bay Police Service were in attendance for the meeting, including the acting chief and deputy chief, though officials say they're unable to comment on the report at this time. One of the police board's newest members, Karen Machado, did speak to us and says while these recommendations will be beneficial, they can't be implemented overnight.
Multi-year and potentially multi-board, depending on, people's times, that they're serving. Because I think the biggest thing is, for myself, and I believe the board is of the same, we want to do it right. We don't necessarily want to do it quick. I mean, if we can do it quick at the same time, don't get me wrong, but we need to get it right.
I don't like it when people think we can achieve more than we can because it creates false expectations. But I also think we can achieve things immediately, and we should be held accountable to doing those things.
Following the release of the report, Anishinaabe Nation Deputy Grand Chief Annabette Achnapaneskin released a statement saying, quote, "The report shows how the service's leadership continues to refuse to accept responsibility for its failures and shows no sign of changing. Without leadership accepting responsibility, it is impossible to expect that serious issues such as systemic racism can even begin to be addressed." NAN did engage with the expert panel through public consultation last year and submitted several recommendations on how to improve the governance and delivery of policing in Thunder Bay. Vasilios Bellos, TBT News.
A house fire in Webequie has prompted new calls to improve first response and First Nations. We'll have that story after the break. Welcome back. A family of 8 in Webequie First Nation lost their home in a house fire over the Easter long weekend. Kiiwetinoong MPP Saul Mamagwa says a lack of fire suppression equipment left the family helpless as their home burned to the ground.
They just had to watch it burn.
Every member of the Shawabik family did manage to get out of the devastating fire alive, but with only the clothes on their back, they have lost their home and everything in it.
It's frightening. It's it's unacceptable. It's discouraging. It's unacceptable, and this should not happen in a place called Canada, in a place called Ontario. That is totally unacceptable. So we can do better, and we must do better.
A GoFundMe campaign has been launched to help the family start over, raising over $5,000 so far. There have been at least 3 other major residential fires in Northern Ontario First Nations this year, including fatal fires in Pekanjikam and Peawanak. The Northwestern Health Unit has publicly released an assessment report outlining the need for safe consumption sites in 4 Northwestern communities. Carl Langdon reports.
Today, Northwestern Health Unit has released a report that examines the need for supervised consumption services in 4 local communities: Kenora, Dryden, Sioux Lookout, and Fort Frances. Each of the 4 communities' rates of substance use harms are significant, and supervised consumption services are recommended to reduce the risk of overdose and overdose deaths to people who use drugs.
Safe consumption sites already exist in Thunder Bay and other parts of the country, such as BC. Dr. Kit Young-Hoon notes some of the major benefits associated with providing these services. Benefits that not only extend to individuals who use drugs, but also to the wider community.
Research has shown that the sites can have benefits, including reducing overdose deaths, decreasing the spread of infectious diseases, reducing discarded drug equipment near the site, and increasing the use of healthcare services, including treatment services.
The assessment offers recommendations to stakeholders, but while the report outlines needs, there's no clear path on who will address them and how. This lack of clarity and the stark differences between the communities named leaves those who are already supportive of the inclusion of safe injection sites seeking practical ways forward. Mayor of Sioux Lookout, Doug Lawrence, noted his appreciation for the services recommended and for what he calls a progressive report on something that needs to be addressed. But he says his community faces unique issues with alcohol and with finding service providers to commit to delivering services locally.
It's really a little bit of an uncertain path. It's the healthcare system or the social service. Where does the line of responsibility lie? We absolutely, I think a safe consumption service would be excellent for Sioux Lookout. But what is it more dire need is a managed alcohol program.
Sioux Lookout's response was to open a safe sobering center in the next coming weeks. The push to deliver the service met many of the same challenges that municipalities named in the report are expected to face. With a limited number of service organizations in the region with the expertise required to take on the task, and a lack of physical space, Lawrence's reservations on where the burden of responsibility lies are bound to be repeated in discussions held across the other 3 communities. Carl Langdon, TBT News.
There's been yet another terrifying incident caught on video involving transports in this region, as 2 cars were forced off Highway 1117 near Chappaqua on Saturday after 3 westbound transports took up all 3 lanes of the highway. This footage was posted on the Skilled Truckers Canada Facebook page. It shows 2 tractor trailers traveling side by side along a curvy section of a passing zone. The one of the right suddenly attempts to pass another transport in front of it, forcing the other rig into the oncoming lane. 2 passenger vehicles narrowly avoided a head-on collision by veering onto the shoulder of the highway. An administrator for the page, which shines a light on unsafe highway drivers, says the 2 transports likely both maxed out their governors as they approached the slower transport, and neither driver was willing to give in and slow down. Local MPP Lise Vaugeois says it's another example of the need for better training rules for truckers in Ontario.
It's terrifying, really. If cars are being forced off the roads, that shouldn't be happening. We see 3 trucks competing with each other to try and get ahead where there's not room to pass. It's not something we can ignore any longer. And if it has to be us in Northwestern Ontario who make the fuss that make the changes across the whole country, then let's do it.
How urgent is this?
I think it's desperate because it's happening again and again and again.
The OPP says they are looking to get in contact with the person who took the video. Well, when we return, the History Channel reality show will be featuring vintage vehicles from the Rainy River area in its upcoming season. Welcome back, and like we were saying before the break, the hosts of a popular TV show on the History Channel made their way to the Rainy River District to film their latest adventures. The second season of Lost Car Rescue debuts on Wednesday, and 3 of the episodes focus on their discoveries in this part of the region. Carl Langton has the story.
Sitting on the side of Highway 11, the Rainy River Railroad Museum is a familiar sight for many, but for the host of Lost Car Rescue, this wasn't only his first visit to the museum, but also his first to Ontario.
Originally, we were contacted by Rainy River, the railroad station there. There was a lovely lady there that represents the museum. One of the original CN vehicles, a truck, was taken out and basically lost on one of the islands, supposedly.
Loaded with tips from the public, Sager and his team took the opportunity to scour the regional landscape. But there was one lead in particular that Sager mentioned as one of his primary motivations for making their longest trip yet.
There was a bit of information that we've dug up that Al Capone had also made landfall on the Canadian side over by Fort Francis. It was pretty amazing to be able to follow the footsteps of where Al Capone had jumped across and being just one step behind them the whole time. It felt like he, could have been alive just driving down the road in the next corner.
Sager wasn't initially certain that the trip would pan out, but this year's success, including the discovery of a magic school bus, has him eyeing the region again for next season.
Oh man, when I was a kid, I used to love watching that show.
The Magic School Bus. Oh, that was the dream when I was a kid. I think it's the very first vehicle I ever fell in love with.
Magic School Bus.
The lichens on it, some greens and some grays, blues. You can't make that. This is exactly what you want. You just clear coat that lichen right on there.
Matt's all excited. He's in love with the patina.
With the number of classic cars here in Northwest Ontario, it should take no time at all to motivate Sager and his team to find their way back.
If you guys see anything cool, feel free to report it. Send an email to me at huntingclassiccars@gmail.com. And yeah, I'd love to see us get back out there in season 3.
Carl Langdon, TBT News.
Millions of dollars in funding was announced this week by Kenora Rainy River MPP Greg Rickford. Nearly $5 million will be going towards 2 projects, highway reconstruction in Dryden and an Indigenous training program in Kenora. Dryden is receiving just shy of $3 million from the province's Connecting Links Fund to rebuild a 1.2-kilometer stretch of Highway 17 called Grand Trunk Avenue, where it cuts through the city. Dryden Mayor Jack Harrison expects the work to be completed in 2024. He says the roadway had been deteriorating and is ready for a complete redo.
To improve the safety of folks coming through our town, our own residents ourselves, because the highway splits our city in half. On the urban side, we use a lot. As well, it's not when you come through Dryden, it's nice to see a nice brand new surface. It speaks well for who we are as a community, that we take care of our city. First impressions are important.
Niwin Wendenamuk is getting almost $2 million for their construction capacity project. It will provide skilled trades apprenticeships for Indigenous workers and at-risk youth, as well as establishing a high skills major program in construction at a nearby First Nations high school. And that's all the time we have for this edition of Northwest Newsweek. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.